Hello everybody, I'm back for the final game of the Taimanov-Fischer match, and we are going to conclude. Let me see if I can turn this gain up a little bit. Maybe you can hear me better there. We're going to conclude this match with a very interesting game that kind of flips the story around and allows Fischer to win with a rook and a knight ending as opposed to the bishop. So we saw some earlier games where the bishop advantage in Fischer's hands was plenty to win, and here we see the knight's advantage in the ending. This is really a fascinating game just because of how solid it is, and Fischer's, again, brilliant endgame strategy. So let's see what happens. e4, Fischer's white, then we see c5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and actually d5, we get the same variation that Fischer kind of tricked Taimanov into giving him a very advantageous position as white. Knight takes, e6, again planning the pelican or the Lasker variation of the Sicilian defense. d6, bishop to f4, e5, bishop back, and then after knight to f6, bishop to g5. Now, of course, instead of that earlier game with queen check, we see bishop develops, and then the knight develops. Chasing the knight back, but actually bishop takes, and then he takes with the pawn, creating this strong center pawn formation, but of course the drawback is the double pawns and the weakened king side. Knight back, and then knight to d4. Now, the main trouble for black is where is he going to castle. Normally he'll just try to keep his king in the center, but of course that can lead to a strong attack for white. Knight to c4, and then f5. So trying to undermine the center and give space for the bishop, or the bishop pair, I should say. Now, the main issue strategically in this position is that white can occupy the d5 square with a knight, and if the light square bishop ever takes, he'll have a long-standing bad bishop against a very strong knight on d5. So this is where the subtlety of this opening comes in, pawn takes, and the reason for pawn takes is after knight takes and bishop to d3, what he's going to do, Fischer, is take the knight, the bishop will take, and then he'll play knight to e3 and plan a knight on d5. So Taimanov prevents this by playing rook to c8, and then after bishop takes, now again if the bishop takes here, he plays knight to e3, and this knight will be on d5, a permanent knight occupying black's weaknesses. Instead, he just takes, rook takes c4, but the drawback is that it further weakens black's pawn structure and his whole position really, because now the light squares are weak, as well as just his entire position on the king side, and he's left with a bad bishop on the same color as his pawns. So let's see how Fischer exploits that. Queen to e2 first, just basically gaining a tempo on that c4 rook, rook to d4. Of course, rook to d4 preventing castling on the queen side. So it's perfectly safe for white to castle on the king side. There's really no strong attack that black will get, due really to the bad placement of the bishop, as well as white's activity in the center. He's really going to own the center, and it's really hard to do a flank attack when the opponent or the opposite opponent owns the center. You have to own the center before you can start attacking on the wings. Queen to g5, preventing white queen from checking or coming into the king side. And after rook to d1, black could have played a little more dynamically by playing rook to g8, but instead we see queen to f5, rook takes, and now actually after knight to e4, bishop up, and rook to d1, Fischer's going to win a pawn because of tactics. So Taimanov has to play queen to e5 to defend that d4 pawn, and the reason is that if he plays e5, it doesn't actually protect the pawn, because then we'd see rook takes. And now if that pawn takes, we see tactics, basic tactics, forking the king and the queen because the bishop's pinned, winning the queen. So, of course, we don't see that, although you wouldn't be surprised given some of the blunders Taimanov's made in his games in this match. Instead, we see the proper move, queen to e5, but after queen to d3, he's going to lose a pawn. So Fischer's won a pawn, and now we see trading down into a rook and knight versus rook and bishop endgame. So Taimanov succeeds in activating all his pieces, his bishop and rook, but his weaknesses, the long-standing pawn weaknesses, are a little too much for him to play against the knight. This weak pawn here, these pawn islands, and white is very strong with 3 pawns on each flank. So let's see what happens. Chasing the knight back, protecting that f2 pawn, rook up, and then g3, just activating the rook and the bishop, bringing the knight back to place it on a better square, protecting the pawn, king up, and now Taimanov launches a minority attack. As I said, there's in the video 2 videos ago, for I think it was the 4th game, the 2 main plans in an endgame are to attack weak pawns, maybe win them, or to create passed pawns for yourself. So Taimanov's following the plan of creating a weakness that he can attack, although there isn't one. So the deep end of the basic plan of attacking your opponent's weak pawns is if there isn't one, you should create one. And a key strategy is to follow a minority attack where you use 2 pawns, for example, or a smaller amount of pawns to create a weak pawn, leaving white hopefully with a weak b pawn, but of course Fischer doesn't allow that. He plays c3, and then we see resumption of the minority attack. What he's going to do, Taimanov, is play b4, and if there's a bunch of trades, then white would be left with an isolated b pawn, very easy to attack and win. Knight to d4, knight to f4 was good as well, just activating the knight. And Fischer's strategy really is to use the knight to create a passed pawn for himself, following the second strategy. And his strategy really is prevailing in this game. So b4, continuing the minority attack, knight back, and then after pawn takes, Bobby Fischer uses the pin on the king to play c4. After the king up, using tactics again, he gets a passed pawn with c5. Very dangerous, and he's already winning at this point, basically. c5 now with the bishop takes, we just see rook to c2, and it's all over, because the rook can't play rook to a5 to protect the bishop. Bishop back, and then knight check. Now, of course, he's not going to take that passed pawn, because after all is said and done, white would be up 2 pawns, and very easily winning rook endgame. So as you can see, the knight creates a lot of tactical opportunities in endgames to win pawns and follow your main strategic goal. For specifically this position, Fischer's main strategic goal is to create a passed pawn. And he keeps doing that, not just the c pawn, but we'll also see how he creates another passed pawn. So f4, and then e5. Now the pawn doesn't want to take, instead we see c6, further advancing his pawn and chasing the king back. Now if the king comes up here, then actually after pawn takes, he can't really take that pawn because of knight to b5. Now the king can't come back, and after the bishop moves, the rook can't come back either, because the knight's covering it. He'll just play c7 and win a bishop. So the king basically has to go back to c8. And now knight to b5 anyway, attacking the d pawn. And if he plays d4, then we see pawn takes. And then there's really no good options, because if the bishop takes, then actually just rook to e2. The bishop goes back. It's all over anyway, because the rook would check. And then we see c7, just checkmating very quickly. Knight takes, rook takes, king up. Oh, let's go back here. So king to c8, rook to b5, or knight to b5. And now he just simply creates another passed pawn with f5. And it's totally over, +4 advantage at this point. Taimanov plays on for a few moves, but after rook takes d5, and then rook takes b2, actually Taimanov resigned in this position because the following line, king to h3, if he plays b3, then we see knight to h7, he's going to win the bishop, Fischer will, and even if he takes the knight after c7, or even f6, more accurate, one of these pawns is going to queen, and black will have to give up his rook. So a very simple and amazing game that shows the benefits of the knight over the bishop in endings. Now, Fischer really gave a masterclass in the rook and bishop and rook and knight endgames in this match, and I'm going to move on now to the Bent Larsen versus Fischer match that was played right after this match. Alright, I'll see you in the future, and thanks for watching. Bye-bye.